My name is Chris Hoy. I was born on August 30th, 1933, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at Idle Hospital. And my parents were older than probably they should be to have a child at their age. My mother was 45, and so, but I guess the birth went fine, and I came out head first like I was supposed to. When I was born, we lived on 47th and Lyndale Avenue South. It was a duplex, and lived there for the first 6 months of my life, and my parents bought a home over on 48th and 10th, 4808 10th Avenue South in South Minneapolis, and that's where I grew up. That's where I went to high school from, and went to college, and actually that's where my parents lived for the rest of their life. My mother and dad both passed away in that home. I have one brother, one sibling. He's 4 years older than I am. He was born in Chicago. My parents at that time were living in Chicago, and he was born in 1929, and they lived down in Chicago for, I think, the next 3 years probably. We hear stories about, and when we were younger, we met some people down there. They had what they called the 4-H club, and it was the Hoys and the Harkises and the Hasties and the Humberts, and so they would go out as couples, and they continued that on for a long time. I don't know where the 4-H club originated or why. I mean, they weren't certainly business partners or anything like that. It was a social thing. First thing that I remember as a child was probably I was maybe 3 years old, and I don't know if I was a brat or what, but I was not going to take my nap. And we had a live-in maid that took care of my brother and I, and her name was Jane Wistrom. And Jane threatened to get in my crib, and she was going to sleep in there. And so she started to climb in the crib, and I had a hissy fit over that. I remember that. Other incidences, I guess, were just, outside briefly. I recall I was in 1941. I can remember I was 6 years old at the time, and I was actually shooting hockey pucks into the garage door, and my mother came out and announced to me that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And I didn't know who the Japanese were, number one, and I had no idea where Pearl Harbor was. So, but growing up in World War II era, I guess you would call it, was a very interesting experience also. We didn't realize at the time, but there was a lot of propaganda that we abided by. I had a victory garden, which was contributing to the war effort because I raised carrots and I raised radishes, and so carrots were kind of scrawny and skinny, and the radishes were really tart. But we felt we got a sign when we had our garden, we could put in the garden, and it was a victory garden. So we were contributing to the war effort. Another thing, back then, every Tuesday we would bring 10 cents to school, and we'd get a stamp, and you put it in a booklet, and after you had $18.75 worth of these 10-cent stamps, you got a war bond. And that in 10 years would mature to $25, again contributing to the war effort. We also saved our scrap metal. My mother, when she cooked bacon, and I don't know what they use this for, but when she cooked bacon or had any kind of fat from her cooking, she saved that in a tin can underneath the sink. And when that was full, we brought it to the meat market, and that was part of the war effort. We did have rationing back then. They rationed sugar, they rationed coffee, they rationed gasoline. I've in fact recently found some ration stamps in the basement. My brother and I guess being 4 years apart, I was certainly the little brother, and we didn't have a real closeness. We grew up together. Both of my parents were born out of the country. My dad was born and raised in Denmark. He came over to this country when he was 19. And my mother was born in Norway, and her family immigrated to this country she was born in 1888, and they came over in 1892. Why they came, I don't know. I do know about my dad. My dad was raised on a farm where he was born in Luna, a small town in western Denmark on the North Sea, and he had gotten his education and went to get a job, and was actually, his expenses for his room and board were more than what he was making on his job, and he quite figured out quite rapidly that was really economically a good program. So and I guess at that time, as I understand it, there was some cousin, excuse me, that had come over to visit, that lived in Clinton, Iowa, and he was talking about the opportunities in this country, and that triggered my dad's wandering lust, I guess, and so he somehow got on a boat and came to this country. He had he had some English, but he didn't have any American English, and so there were some stories about when he first got here. I recall one that he worked at in a railroad station, or in the freight office at the railroad station, and some big truck driver came in and wanted him to sign some bills of lading, and so he instructed my dad to put your John Hancock on here. And my dad looked at him and wrote John Hancock on about 7 bills of lading, and the guy thought he was a wiseacre and was going to take after him, but my dad just quite honestly did what he was instructed to do. So, but he got along fine, and I think he met my mother. I've got in about 1912 or 1914, somewhere in Minneapolis. And then my dad realized that he could become a naturalized citizen of this country, which he wanted to do if he didn't have to wait. They had a waiting period of, I think it was 5 or 10 years for immigrants before they would be eligible to become citizens. And so he found out that if he enlisted in the military, he could become a citizen immediately. So, and that was World War I. So in 1917, he enlisted in the Army, and became a citizen of this country. I don't know where he had his basic training, but he did end up fighting, or I should say, over in the France during World War I. I don't know how much fighting he did. Later on, he became very active in the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and he used to take me on some fishing trips that were sponsored by these Legionnaires, and they would get into, after they had a few libations, they would get into some of their old war stories, and it was quite interesting because one individual showed me where he had gotten speared by a German bayonet, and then my dad got into his war stories about how they snuck up on a farm. They thought the Germans were there, and there were no Germans, but there was a farmer and his wife, and they tied up the farmer and went down in France and drank all his wine, sat in the wine cellar and drank his wine. So that was his war stories. Anyway, they came back, and from I guess I would say 1919 to 1929, my folks lived in Chicago primarily. My dad had jobs selling clothing. He worked for a company called Browning King, and he was a salesman. And then in 1929, my brother was born in Chicago. They stayed there, and I don't know why they transported up to Minneapolis. It could have been job-wise. My mother had a couple of cousins that lived in Minneapolis, and so they came to Minneapolis. Well, as I mentioned, both mom and dad were both born in foreign countries. My mother came over with her family in 1888, and they settled in Neillsville, Wisconsin. She came with her mother and father and her sister Inga. I don't know why they came, because I've been back over to Norway where they lived, and I suppose this was a land of opportunity. And my grandfather, who I never knew, was a cabinet maker. He did woodworking, and they settled in Neillsville. My mother's sister died in, I think it's 1923. All three of them are buried in Crystal Lake Cemetery here in Minneapolis. My mother had some cousins that also immigrated to this country. She had one cousin, Carrie Tranhus was her name, but she married a guy named Gilbert, or a gentleman named Gilbert, and they had 4 children, and they lived also in Minneapolis. She lived in North Minneapolis, so we did see them when we were younger. She also had a cousin, Karen Platt, and Karen never married. First I knew of her, she was living in Seattle, in Washington, and she was a maid or a governess. That was her job, and then she came to Minneapolis here. Being the fact that both of my parents immigrated to this country, we never grew up with any grandparents, any aunts, uncles, didn't have a family. The cousins of my mother's were her first cousins, and they were not that close to her. As a consequence, or as a result, guess I would say. On holidays, we didn't really have a big family gathering. It was my mother and dad, my brother and I. And once in a while, there might be, they had some acquaintances that we knew, but we didn't have, I used to, when we get together with my mother's cousin's family, I used to be almost jealous that, they had a family, we didn't. And then my mind would wander, and when I was little, and I thought maybe I was adopted. So, who knows? My brother and I, like I had said before, he's 4 years older, and we really we weren't that close, but we had neighborhood friends. Where we grew up, there were children our age. He had his group and I had my group, and these are friends that we went through grade school, junior high, and high school together. And we played a lot of, we didn't, I guess one of the advantages, I think in talking with classmates and people that I grew up with, we feel we were the most fortunate generation to grow up in, because we didn't have television. We did later. I mean, when we were teenagers, television came in. But when we were growing up, all we had was books and radio. And when you listened to the radio, and we had certain serial programs we listened to, Hop Harrigan and Captain Midnight and Jack Armstrong, and from the stories you'd conjure up in your mind's eye what these people looked like and what they were doing, and everybody had their own idea. The same way with reading books. That's reading books now. I'll read a book and they'll make a movie out of the book, and I'll go to the movie and I figure they've done it all wrong, because this is the way I think, it should be, that what I conjure up in my mind's eye. We also played outside a lot. I mean, in the winter, we enjoyed winter. We skated. Remember, when I was, probably 4 or 5, 6 years old, across the street from us, there was a vacant lot. The houses were being built, but there was a vacant lot there, and a guy that lived next door named Bill Greer to the vacant lot, he dammed up the sides and flooded it, and we had a skating rink there. And we played hockey over there, and we skated, and the next spring, they started to dig a hole there, and they're going to put a house in there, which they eventually did, but we tried to do as much as we could to prevent them from doing that, because they wrecked our skating rink. We also did a lot of, we played in the street. We played hockey in the street. They didn't have all the salt and the sand that they do now, so the streets would get plowed, but they would be icy. And we'd put 2 tin cans up on each end, and that would be the goals, and we'd run up and down with our hockey sticks and played hockey in the street. The mode of transportation that we used back when I was growing up was the streetcar system. Minneapolis had an excellent public transportation system in the form of streetcars. And we could get on the streetcar and go downtown. You could transfer, you could go up north. You could go both north and south, east and west. And there was a connection between Minneapolis and St. Paul. It was called the Selby Lake Line, which went across from Lake Street across to Selby Avenue in St. Paul. And also you could do that from downtown through the University Avenue. So we could get anywhere on the streetcars. And it was the streetcar. When we first moved in, we lived on 48th and 10th, and 48th in Chicago was the end of the line. Then they extended it up to 54th in Chicago. But the streetcars would turn around and start back downtown again. There was no streetcar schedule. You just kind of went over and waited for a streetcar, and then when the streetcar came, you got on it. We would ride our bikes down to the closest park was Pearl Park, and so we would put our baseball mitts on. When growing up, even though we didn't have much encouragement from my parents on participating in sports, there was nothing that was against it, but we used to, have our little, we played in the street a lot, but then we'd ride our bikes down to, it was Pearl Park, which was, probably 15 blocks, 10, 12 blocks, 15 blocks away. And we'd have pickup baseball games there. When, in growing up, we played football in the fall, and when fall was over, we'd play basketball or play hockey, and then when winter was over, we grabbed our baseball mitts and we played baseball. And we did, some of the homes, the garages, the people had put baskets up, so we did in the summertime play basketball or shoot baskets at some of the houses. But for the most part, we played the sports that were the sports of the time. We there was the first organized, I guess I would say real organized sports that we played, that I played, when between 7th grade and 8th grade, there was a coach, Jack Martin, who coached football team, and he was a good football player at Washburn High School, and lived in the neighborhood, and so we played midget football. We had to go and get our own sponsor. We had jerseys, but we had to get our own sponsor to buy the jersey, or you had to buy it yourself, which was not feasible. My folks weren't going to buy me a football jersey. So I had to, there was a real estate company down on 48th in Chicago, and I went in and talked them into paying the, whatever it was, $5 or $8 for the jersey, and then I had William F. Olson on my back for real estate. And we were all a mishmash of different sponsors. I remember his friend Earl Johnson, he had two dentists, Dr. Reese and Dr. Conlon, that sponsored him. So, but our football team was pretty darn good, because we ended up winning the city championship. We won all of our games. In fact, we were undefeated and untied and unscored upon. So it was quite a good team. And we continued on with that I played midget football, and then light junior it was called, and then junior football. And by the time I played on 10th grade team, and I really didn't like to practice, and it was too too dusty and dirty for me. And by that time I had really baseball and basketball were the two sports that I enjoyed the most. So and probably were better at than I was at football. We did have the same individual, Jack Martin, coached two basketball teams that I played on in 8th grade and in 9th grade, midget basketball. And then we did have I guess I'd call it like a midget baseball team that LaSalle Tire sponsored. And then in high school, like I mentioned, football was not my cup of tea, so I gave up football, and I played on the 10th grade basketball team, which now I guess would be called junior varsity. In 11th grade, I made the varsity team, and played quite a bit as a junior, which was not, well, I would say it's kind of it was unusual. There were a lot of, most of the basketball players were seniors that played on the team. And then my senior year, I was co-captain with Earl Johnson and a starter. And then in baseball, in my 10th grade, that spring, I had sinus infections, and I played on the 10th grade team, but was hoping to play on the varsity team. Didn't make the varsity team. Well, I didn't even get to try out, so it was kind of hard for me to make it. And the same darn thing happened in 11th grade. However, 11th grade I was on the team. Between 11th and 12th grade, I played Legion baseball, American Legion, for Richfield. The Richfield Legion club, if you will, was the one that sponsored Washburn High School baseball. And we won the city championship and then went into the state tournament. The ballparks, we played at all public fields, I guess, or parks, all of our games, but then they had the playoffs. There were two minor league baseball teams in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. There was the Minneapolis Millers, and they played down on, it was a field called Nicollet Field, down on 31st and Nicollet Avenue. It had fences and everything. And the St. Paul team was the St. Paul Saints, and they played at Lexington Ballpark over on Lexington Avenue and University. And both of those were they were the nicest fields around. Well, we played our playoff games down at Nicollet Ballpark, and then the state tournament was over at Lexington. And we went through the state tournament, winning our first two games, and the team from St. Paul won their first two games. And so the finals was on a Monday night, and they had a big, over at Lexington Ballpark, and they had a big write-up about how ideal it was that the two powerhouses from each city was going to meet in the finals. And we got over there, and it was just a comedy of errors. And when the dust had settled, they beat us 18-1. So, but it still was a pleasant memory from playing in the state tournament. In my senior year at Washburn, they had the North and the South. They had 11 high schools at the time. And they had the North and the South would play for the city championship down at Nicollet Ballpark, where the Millers played. And we played down there under the lights, which was a pretty big deal at the time. And we ended up losing the first. We played Edison, Minneapolis Edison High School, and we lost the first game and then won the second. And the championship we lost, I think it was 7-5. So, and that I didn't play any baseball in college. I enjoyed baseball. I still enjoy watching it, and in service and afterwards, I did play some softball. So, and growing up. During the war, there was not a lot of money or a lot of jobs, and we used to shovel snow to make money. We called snow white gold, and I did get an allowance from my parents. But also, I started back when I was 10 years old. I had a Look magazine and a Collier's magazine route, if you will. And there were three magazines: Liberty Magazine, Collier's, and Look. And I would get those delivered to my house, and then I would go over to 48th in Chicago, which had a lot of merchants and stuff, and try to sell them to the local doctors, dentists, to put in their office. And so I had a clientele that I had built up where I probably sold 5 Colliers and 6 Look magazines and maybe 10 Liberty magazines. But it gave me some money. Couldn't have a paper out till I was 12. There were, back then, actually 3 papers in the city of Minneapolis. We had the Minneapolis Times, we had the Minneapolis Star, and we had the Minneapolis Tribune. The Times weren't as strict or didn't monitor the age limit. You had to be 12 to have a paper out, but anybody could get a Times route. So when I was 11, I had a Times route. So I had my Collier's magazine route and my Times route. And then when I turned 12, I got the, I guess you'd call it the big route, which was the Minneapolis Star, which was the afternoon paper, the Minneapolis Tribune, which is a morning paper, and then they had a Sunday paper also. The bad thing about the paper routes, or a thing I didn't like, I guess it wasn't a bad thing, you had to go collect for the paper. So you had to, and every Saturday you had to, what they called pay your bill. You had to go to the paper shack and pay the bill. And I had a route, and I had it for, well, from age 12 until I was probably 16, and the same paper route. But what I did is I collected half my route one week and half the route the next week, so I had enough money to pay the bill, and it worked out fine. When I got into high school and started playing sports after school, I couldn't have the paper on. There was a fellow that took over the route that didn't want to get up in the morning, so I continued on delivering morning papers, and he just paid me. I didn't have to collect. It was, I thought, a good deal. Also, there was a local grocery store down on 48th in Chicago, Stillman's, where my brother got a job, and they had, there were 3 grocery stores on the corner, 48th in Chicago. One, always, they delivered groceries, which you could call up and give them your grocery list, and they had a truck and they would deliver it to your house. Stillman's, trying to compete with that, had bag boys or young men that would carry the groceries out to your car and put them in the, and that's one of the jobs that I got there. And then in fact, I got a lot of my buddies' jobs there. There were, 5 or 6 of us that hung around together that worked at Stillman's. When I got into my senior year, junior year and senior year in high school, and we were playing on the weekends, I got another job on the corner at a florist, flower shop. And what I did was, in the summertime, delivered flowers for them. It was they had a truck, and we delivered flowers. As I had mentioned, the holidays were just my mother and dad and brother and I. Holidays were a big boom time for the florists. So at Christmas, we worked very long hours because we had not only had to decorate or trim the poinsettias and flowers, but deliver them, and he had quite a good business. Easter was the same way with the Easter lilies. Mother's Day, a lot of corsages to be delivered. The proms, there were a lot of corsages and flowers. So holidays for the most part, I worked. I even worked a lot on Christmas Day or Christmas morning, and Easter Sunday, making sure that the flowers got delivered. So those were jobs that I had during high school and college. Also, at that time, an individual that I made good friends with, or was a real close friend, was a fellow named Dick Cumlin. And Dick and we played basketball together, we played baseball together, but also his dad was an ardent duck hunter. And he had some land out near Benson, Minnesota that he had leased, and he took Dick and his brothers out, Denny and David, hunting, and Dick would invite me along to hunt ducks. I had never hunted ducks. My dad didn't hunt ducks. He had hunted with some of his friends pheasants out in South Dakota. They'd go out there and then they'd bring back a raft of pheasants from South Dakota. But anyway, I had a shotgun, and so in the fall, when we used to play football, every weekend now we would go duck hunting, which was really a fun thing for me. And this continued on through college and later on in later years, or when we got married, when I got married and had a family, and actually took 2 sons out duck hunting. I remember Dick and I were real close. Dick ended up dying at age 34 of cancer, and he probably was my closest friend. He played basketball down at Gustavus and was a good basketball player, and when we first got married, we played basketball together over in St. Paul. And Karen, my wife, saw him. He was single still, and saw him and figured he should be married. So she ended up fixing him up with his wife. Her name was Jo Lovis. But going back to the hunting part, Karen was pregnant with our first child, Kathy, and we went hunting, still went hunting on the weekend, and the wives wanted to go too, so this time we were down by Rochester, and we went pheasant hunting, and Karen was walking, we were walking the ditches by the railroad tracks for pheasants, and we put her up on the railroad tracks, because that was easier walking with Kathy in her stomach, so... But anyway, hunting took over for football, pretty much. I had graduated from Washburn in 1951. That year, during the basketball season, there were 4 players that went down to Gustavus Adolphus College down in St. Peter, with the idea that we were going to go to Gustavus school. It was back when we grew up, or when I grew up, I guess I would say we were pretty much in a structured environment, in that you went to school, you went to junior high school, and you went to high school. When you got out of high school, you went to college. When you got out of college, you went in the service, because they had the compulsory military training, the draft. And when you got out of the service, you got married, and the first thing you did is have babies. Now, it wasn't necessarily in that order. I mean, there were some friends of mine that got married out of high school, but it was just almost a given that everybody went to college, and another given that you had the military service. in 1951, the Korean War broke out. We had the four of us went down to Gustavus. It was Dick Cumlin, Earl Johnson, Dick Grine, and myself. And we were down there for a weekend, and we played basketball, and they were going to help subsidize our room and board or tuition, and by working, they had a mental hospital, or they have a mental hospital down in St. Peter, and we were going to get jobs there, or jobs on campus. And when we were driving home, we almost all cut our thumbs and said, hey, this is what we're going to do. Next year we'll be down here. Earl Johnson was probably the best basketball player of the four of us, and before he graduated, the coach over at the University of Minnesota got a hold of Earl and offered him a scholarship to the university. Ozzie Cowles was the coach, and so Earl got a Williams scholarship, so he didn't go to Gustavus. Dick Grine, he wanted to go to Carleton College because that was an Episcopal school, and he had his designs on becoming a geologist. I didn't know what I wanted to become, but when the Korean War broke out in 1951, my brother, who was in the Naval Reserve, got called up for active duty. And my dad was a traveling salesman, and so he didn't want me to leave my mother home alone, and so asked if I would not go to Gustavus, go over to Hamlin or go to some other school in the city. So I ended up at Hamlin. Dick Cumlin did go to Gustavus and was successful in playing basketball down there. I went out for the basketball team at Hamlin, as they had a freshman team. Back then they had freshmen in the MIAC conference were eligible to play, but they had quite a good freshman schedule. And I was on the freshman team, and then as a sophomore I played on the varsity team. Hamlin was a basketball school. In fact, there was a lot of bantering back and forth who was better, the University of Minnesota or Hamlin. Hamlin actually had, prior to my coming there, three players that played for Coach Joe Hutton, that played with the Minneapolis Lakers, professional basketball team. In my sophomore year, right in the beginning of the year, when we were practicing, we were going to go up to play St. John's. I was in one of the drills, and I drove into the basket, and there were some little kids from the local grade school that were shooting at the side baskets, and one of their balls had gotten away from them and was under the basket. I had come in and made the layup and came down and stepped right on the basketball and blew my knee out. And so that pretty much ended my basketball playing at Hamlin. I ended up graduating from Hamlin in 1955, but did play basketball in some city league teams in Minneapolis. On completing Hamlin in 1955, I guess my mother and father and I traveled over to Europe. My dad had not been back to Denmark, and nor my mother back to Norway, where they were born, since I think my dad went back in 1929, but my mother hadn't been back since 1923. So they had inherited some money, my dad's inheritance, and that's what paid for the trip over to Denmark and Norway, which was kind of a unique experience for me. I enjoyed it. I thought I was not going to enjoy it. And I met two of my dad's sisters, or my aunts. I met scads of cousins that were really, really nice people. We did get up to Norway and up into the where my mother was born. She was born in a little town called Randsburg, up in Gudbrandsdalen, which is north of Lillehammer in Norway. And we got over to Norway. Well, I'll back it up. The tickets were purchased in Denmark, and as a result, we took a train from Minneapolis to New York City on a sleeper, which in itself was a fun experience. And then we boarded a ocean liner, the USS Oslofjord, and for 7 days traveled from New York to our first port of call, which was Stavanger, Norway. And that was a very enjoyable experience. We traveled first class. We had to dress for dinner every evening. There was lots of stuff to do on board the ship, and lots of fun. I mean, each night there was a show, and it was really that in itself was an enjoyable trip. In fact, the ship itself, the Oslofjord, it took 7 days crossing. Then they would stop in Stavanger, they'd stop in Bergen, they'd stop in Oslo, and stop in Copenhagen. Well, that would take 9 days total, one way, and then they would be in Copenhagen for 3 days. There were many people from the East Coast that would spend their 3-week vacation just going on that cruise, and then have 3 days in Copenhagen and get back on the ship and come back to the States. So it was in itself a vacation. In order to go, I should back it up. And going back to starting at Hamlin, at that time, because of the Korean War, they had compulsory military service in this country, so everybody had to register for the draft. And in order to stay out of the draft or be deferred, get some deferment other than A1 or 1A, you either had to be in school, you had to be married, you had to have some other something wrong with you. Well, I was in school, I wasn't married, I didn't have anything wrong with me, so my first year at Hamlin I was entitled to, but then you had to have your grades at a certain level to entitle you to the second year, which I was able to do, and also for the third year. But to get to the fourth year, you had to be in the upper, I think it was upper quarter of the class, which I was not. So I had to take a draft deferment test. And I did pass that, which was very difficult. So it entitled me to my senior year, and I graduated from Hamlin. But I had to get permission from the draft board to leave the country upon graduation, because I had no longer any reason to be deferred. And I think I graduated like on June 14th and June 16th. I was declared 1A again. So I did get that deferment and to go over to Europe. And when I came back, I had to let them know I was back, and I got drafted shortly thereafter into the Navy. One of the things that happened in 1951, because there was the battle over in Korea, a lot of the individuals didn't want to be in the Army. So they enlisted in the Navy and enlisted in the Air Force. Well, in 1955, those were 4-year hitches. In 1955, there was a lot of individuals getting out of the Navy, and they weren't making it a career. And so they, in fact, doubled the draft in November and December of '55. And I had a choice if I wanted to go in the Army or the Navy. And I took the Navy, which is another experience. So anyway, going back, we were over in Europe. We did get up to, we took a trip down into Germany, which I thoroughly enjoyed. We met all of the aunts and uncles and cousins that we have in Denmark, and some cousins that lived up in Norway. We unplanned ran into one of my mother's cousins' children, the Gilberts, Angie or M. Gilbert. Emery was, he had developed or was involved in developing the refrigeration system that enabled people to have ice rinks outside. And he had backing from individuals he went to North High School in Minneapolis, an individual named Morris Chalfin, who had a lot of money, and they developed Holiday on Ice. Holiday on Ice was an international ice show that traveled around the world, and they played in a variety of venues that didn't have indoor ice rinks. We ran into them by coincidence in Oslo, and at the time the reason they were there was for the Sonja Henie, the ice show. Sonja Henie was an Olympic skater from Norway, and so we got to go to that, which was a fun experience too. We got back from Europe and or from our trip to Denmark and Norway, and I immediately became eligible for the draft. We got back in late August, I think it was 1st of September, and on the 14th of November I got drafted into the Navy. I spent 14 weeks down at Great Lakes in Illinois through boot camp. I didn't like military service. I thought I was fulfilling an obligation that a lot of my friends had fulfilled, and yeah. And so I went along with it. Fortunately for me, the basketball coach down at Great Lakes, I guess had spotted my resume or knew something of Hamline University and the fact that it was a basketball, or there were a lot of good basketball players that came out of there. So he grabbed a hold of me right early in boot camp and had me come over, and I tried out for the basketball team and made it. And so that got me out of a lot of duty that you have as a recruit in boot camp. I didn't have any KP. I didn't have to stand any watches. We would play basketball. We'd play 3 times a week basketball games, and then he would get me out of some physical training, or PT, physical torture, I guess you'd call it, because he had claimed that we had to have practice, or he had. So he was really good for me, good to me, I guess I would say. We had 80 men in our company down in boot camp, and when we'd have a basketball game, we couldn't eat at the mess hall or the chow hall before the game. So after the game, we got to go to the chow hall, and they would cook us whatever we wanted, but usually it was steaks. We would have steak and all the steak we wanted, milk and what have you. So there were, boot camp was very strict. It was an experience that you really didn't want to screw up in, and you had to have, the only dirty clothes you could have in the Navy were the clothes that you had on your back. So I had a couple of guys, buddies that I'd met that would do my washing every night for me, and in return, I'd smuggle back, you couldn't have food in the barracks. I remember when the first mail call we got, one guy got a big box of cookies from his wife. And he had to sit up in the quarterdeck, which is a table, it's a picnic table in the, right where you came into the barracks. And he had to stand there, and we all had to gather around and watch him eat all the cookies. And any cookies he couldn't eat, he had to throw away. That was, we were run by the Marines, and I had trouble with the military and the regimentation with the military. In fact, I did a lot of push-ups. I probably, when I left boot camp, I was in the best shape that I was ever in my life, because I resisted, I didn't get in trouble, but I resisted the frivolity, I guess I would say, of military service. I mean, the company commander would come in and he'd say, "Hoy, where's your sea bag?" And I'd say, "It's right over there against the wall, sir." "Wall? Where do you see a wall?" I said, "Oh, there's a wall there, and there's a wall over there, and there's a wall, and those are bulkheads. Give me 25. So I'd do 25 push-ups, and then it would come back, and there'd be another dumb question, and I'd say, "Yeah, it's by that post." "That's not a post, that's a stanchion. Give me 25. So I did a lot of 25s. But be that as it may, I also made a lot of friends, because I would smuggle food back into the barracks. And in fact, just before we left, it was probably a week and a half before, when our season was over, I came in and I smuggled in on my pea coat, up in the sleeves of my pea coat, I had 6 cartons of milk and 6 steaks. And I came in, everybody was supposed to be sleeping, and walked in and got literally tackled by the quarterdeck table and stripped, and they took, 6 guys got steaks and milk. So, but I don't know if this had anything to do with it, but they had an award in boot camp for, I don't know if it was a popularity contest or what, but they had an award called the Honor Man. And it was you were voted this, and I made Honor Man of our company, 665, down at Great Lakes training station, and I got a nice ID bracelet, which I've never worn, and it's sitting in the drawer up in my desk with the dog tags that I have subsequently never worn. Military service, I went from Great Lakes to Astoria, Oregon, which was shore duty. Normally, if you had a enlisted personnel with 4 years in the service, 4 years in the Navy, you'd have 2 years of sea duty, being out at sea on board a ship, and 2 years of shore duty, being stationed somewhere at a shore station. Most of the guys out of boot camp went to sea duty. I ended up going to Astoria, Oregon, which was really a great venue, and it was a decommissioning base at the mouth of the Columbia River. Again, I had no, they didn't know what to do with me when I got there, because I was a college graduate. They had never had a college graduate enlisted since World War II. They didn't want me to go down and chip paint off of these. It was a decommissioning base off of the ships that would come in to be decommissioned. So they put me in the dispersing office, which is the pay office. And I became a dispersing clerk. That was my billet, if you will. So I didn't have any duty, any watches to do, because the dispersing clerk was, or the supply office, their watch venue was the library. And we had waves that would go up and sit in the library on the base, and I wasn't one of them. So I played basketball at Tongue Point and enjoyed it. Made friends with, they had some civilian people that worked in the dispersing office, and there was a family, the Woldridges, that kind of adopted me, and so I got to go to their house on the weekends. Oh, we would go out and dig clams. We fished salmon at the mouth of the Columbia. It was good duty. Then all of a sudden I get my notice that I'm being transferred to sea duty, which I wasn't counting on. So I left there, counting my boot camp, which I started boot camp on the 14th of November, 1955. Counting my boot camp, my year of shore duty was up on the 13th of November, 1956. So I got transferred onto a troop transport ship. It was called the General A.E. Anderson, and it was stationed out of Treasure Island, San Francisco. And what it did is transport troops to various locations, unload and offload troops, various locations across the Pacific. I got down to Treasure Island, and my ship was over in Yokohama, Japan. So, but it took them about 6 or 7 days for them to figure out where I was and where my ship was. So they, all of a sudden, everything was top secret in the middle of the night. Got me out of bed, and I had to pack my sea bag, went to Moffett Field, and flew over to Japan to get on board the ship. It was a interesting flight. We sat on I don't know what it was, I guess a transport plane, but it wasn't a commercial liner. We sat sideways, I guess you'd call it. We landed in Hawaii and gassed up. We landed in Wake Island and gassed up, and then landed in Natsuki, Japan, and I went down into what was called a receiving station in Yokosuka, Japan. And after being there for about 4 days, and top secret, couldn't find out where my ship was. It wasn't in Yokohama. Finally, another guy that had been there for a while asked me if I wanted to go over to on leave or over into town, have a few beers. So we went in there and had a few beers in this Japanese saloon and talked to the waitress, and she wanted to know what ship I on, and I said, I don't know, I'm supposed to be on the General Anderson. Oh, General Anderson, that's in Seattle. I said, Seattle? Yes, General Anderson on the way to Seattle. I said, okay. So, long and the short, I had 3 weeks of sitting in a receiving station in Yokosuka, Japan, and they had rerouted the ship from Yokohama, instead of going to Treasure Island to Seattle and then back to Yokohama. And I got on board the ship on the 22nd of December, 1956. It was, I could have walked from Treasure Island up to Seattle and got the ship, but didn't. Couldn't. So I got on the ship, and I didn't know anything about being on board a ship. didn't know anything about anything. And it was Christmas Eve. I hadn't, because I had been in transport since the 14th of November. I didn't have any mail because I didn't have any letters that I got. I hadn't heard from anybody so I was I wasn't a homesick puppy, but I was alone, I guess I'd call it. So I get out, I went to church on Christmas Eve. They had a church service. I went to church Christmas Eve, went to bed. We were heading to Incheon, Korea. I knew that much. And I knew it was cold. Incheon was something like 25 below zero or some ridiculous number. And all of a sudden, I'm sound asleep in the wreck, and this big guy, bosun mate, comes down and said, "Oi!" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You got to watch." I said, "I got what?" I said, "You got to watch." I said, "I got to watch what?" He says, "You've got the duty." I said, "What the hell are you talking about?" He said, "You're up on the bridge." I said, "Up on the bridge?" "Yeah." He said, "And put everything on that you own because it's colder than a son of a bitch up there." And I said, "Oh, geez." I said, "Wait a minute, I don't even know where the bridge is." So he waited for me, and I got dressed, and I put all the clothes on I could, and I go up to the bridge where and you're supposed to stand outside on one of these wings and with binoculars and look for ships out there. Now this is a troop transport, and it's got about $3 million worth of radar that's twirling around up on the top of the ship, and I'm supposed to sit there with binoculars and look for boats, which to me was ridiculous. So he said, and every half hour, I was standing out there, every half hour you come in and report to the officer of the deck that the port side light and running lights are on. And so I said, "Okay." So I'm standing out there, and I look at my clock, and a half hour comes by, and I walk in and on the bridge, and it's in the middle of the night. I'm walk in, and the lights are dim, and there's nobody there, and hello, and there's no answer. Hello, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this officer appears, and yes, and I said, "The lights are on, sir." "You what?" I said, "The lights. I was told I was supposed to report the lights." He said, "You don't report them that way, sailor." I said, "I don't understand." And he said, "You're supposed to report the port side light and running lights are bright lights, sir." I said, "Yes, sir. The port side lights and running lights are bright lights, sir." "Very good. Get back to your post. Thank you, sir." So I did that, and I had the duty, which that was one of my fun experiences. So anyway, I guess I'm digressing here, but the ended up making 7 round trips across the Pacific in a year. Actually, less than a year, in 9 months. It would take us, if we steamed full speed ahead, it would take us 14 days to go from Treasure Island to Yokohama, Japan, which is our two main ports. But we would stop in Hawaii, we would stop in Korea, we'd stop in Okinawa, and offload and unload troops. We'd go down from Treasure Island to San Diego and pick up Marines and go across. Okinawa, one kind of interesting thing, we got off, you didn't get off the ship very long. I mean, we would have like 8 hours of liberty or 6 hours of liberty, and sometimes you got to stay overnight, but very seldom. But we got off in Okinawa, and we had put together a softball team and went over and played the locals there in the softball, which was kind of fun. And one of the guys that were stationed on Okinawa, I started talking to and asked him if, what you guys were doing there, because it's just a rock out in the middle of the Pacific where Nobody. Oh, he said, yeah. He said about 6 months ago, and he pointed up to this hillside where there were some caves up there, and he said about 6 months ago, we captured 11 Japanese soldiers from World War II that didn't know the war was over, and they were holed out there, and we didn't know they were there, but they would sneak down into our camp and steal food and stuff, and they were waiting for I guess their comrades to come and take over Okinawa again, and poor guys didn't know the war was over. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But I got out of the military unscathed, and I was. They decided in their infinite wisdom, the government, that drafting into the Navy was not a good program. They weren't getting good sailors, and so they let us out actually 3 months early. Instead of being in for 2 years, I got out on, it was in August, the end of August in 1957.